On the 14th of January, 2016, a knock at the door would turn a normal winter evening into an act of planned savagery. A life ended in a few merciless minutes, a family left broken, and a police investigation that would unspool a 2-year obsession that read like something out of a dark novel. This is the story of Sadie Hartley, 60, businesswoman, horse enthusiast, partner and mother, and of 2 women who conspired to take her life, Sarah Williams and Katrina Kit Walsh. A plot that had been planned, rehearsed, and chronicled long before the fatal knock. Welcome to Dark Matter TV, where we uncover the darkest truths that hide behind ordinary doors. T's story begins on a quiet January evening in the English countryside. The kind of night when the world feels still, when you'd never expect evil to be standing just beyond the threshold. But for 60-year-old Sadie Hartley, that knock at the door was the sound of her fate arriving. A single moment, a brief buzz of a stun gun, and then a frenzy of violence so shocking, detectives would later call it one of the most calculated murders they had ever seen. This isn't just a story about jealousy. It's a story about obsession. About how 2 women, Sarah Williams and her friend Katrina Kit Walsh, turned envy into a long, deliberate plan for murder. What began as a love triangle spiraled into an 18-month campaign of surveillance, deceit, and death. A crime so cold-blooded it stunned an entire nation. So sit back and prepare to step into the mind of obsession, where love curdles into hatred and a single desire to possess someone can destroy everything in its path. With that being said, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, like the video, share the story, and leave your thought below. Sadie Catherine Hartley was not a recluse. She ran a small but successful medical communications business, kept horses, and welcomed visitors at her home in Helmshire, Lancashire. She loved family gatherings. She had plans for her daughter's upcoming wedding, and she lived openly with her partner Johnston, a man she had loved for years, their life punctuated by the small rituals of domestic happiness. And on the evening of January 14th, 2016, those ordinary rituals were interrupted by a knock at her door. At roughly 8 p.m. there was a knock, the sort that suggests a neighbor, a delivery, the ordinary business of life. Sadie answered, and the world she knew ended in minutes, because at the other side stood a woman who would stun her and then stab her repeatedly in a deliberate, brutal act that had been planned for months. The attacker used a high-powered stun device, a cattle prod-style weapon they had purchased abroad, to paralyze Sadie for a heartbeat long enough for the violence to be carried out, and she was stabbed more than 40 times in what prosecutors later described as an orgy of violence, the wounds a catalog of hatred rather than of heat-of-the-moment passion. To understand why a person would plan such a meticulous and cruel murder, you must follow the story back to where friction and obsession take hold. To a ski slope in Manchester, where Sarah Williams met Johnston, where a friendship with him evolved into an obsession, where Williams refused to accept the end of a personal relationship and plotted to reclaim a man by removing the woman who stood in her way, Sadie Hartley, the long-standing partner Ian had chosen to build a life with. Over the following months, Sarah's behavior hardened into fixation. She began to stalk, to monitor, and to manipulate the lives of those she envied, convinced that Sadie was the roadblock to a future she believed she deserved. Then there was Katrina Walsh, often called Kit, who prosecutors say became entangled with Sarah's plan, a woman whose own vulnerabilities made her susceptible to Sarah's manipulations, who bought the stun gun, who purchased tracking devices, who bought a car and arranged logistics, and who kept detailed diaries that mapped out the murderous plan across months. Diaries that would later prove to be some of the most incriminating pieces of evidence in court. Entries that read like the minutes of a conspiracy and that left no room for doubt about intent. In those pages, the pair rehearsed scenarios, plotted timings, and even conducted dry runs. For example, leaving flowers on Sadie's door to test her response. Small rehearsals that showed their intent before the lethal act. On January 14th, 2016, Sadie returned from tending her horse. She came in. She carried out small domestic tasks. She expected nothing out of the ordinary. The evening was ordinary until the knock. Williams at the door with the stun gun concealed. The device deployed to paralyze, then knives, then brutality. Sadie stabbed repeatedly in her own home, blood smeared and terror brief and fatal. Her body left where the violence had been carried out, a violent end to a life that had been targeted, a schematic of cruelty she could not have imagined. The next day, concern from colleagues and family led to the discovery of her body and the immediate launch of a murder inquiry. The case against Williams and Walsh hadn't been accidental. Police quickly uncovered a thread of physical and documentary evidence, Small mistakes that piled up into a mountain. Firstly, the stun gun itself, recovered and linked to the injuries sustained by Sadie. Secondly, traces of Sadie's DNA found in Williams' home. A tiny but damning transfer. And crucially, the diaries kept by Kit Walsh, which spelled out plotting, rehearsals, and intent. The diaries describing the planning that had taken place over about 18 months, the pair having bought a GPS tracker to follow Ian, and even using a dry run of flowers left at Sadie's door a week earlier to time and test the plan. The tracker logs would also betray their movements and associate them with the crime locations. These mistakes, the physical forensic links, and the intimate documentary evidence, together built the prosecution's case until it was nearly unassailable. Detectives working the case moved quickly and methodically. They interviewed friends and family, mapped mobile phone pings, followed bank and purchase records, and forensically examined the scene for every transfer of matter that could reveal a link. One of those tiny fragments of truth was DNA on a bath, and a pair of glasses with a microscopic hint of blood that connected Williams to Sadie. Another was travel and purchase evidence showing the purchase of the stun gun in Germany and other items used in the plan, and perhaps most chillingly the paper trail in Kit's diaries, which showed not only the plotting but Kit's own rationalizations and descriptions of meetings with Sarah. These notebook pages read like entries in a shared plan, step by step, day by day, until the night in January when those plans were executed. Within days, both women were arrested and charged, each accused of playing essential roles in a crime the court later described as obsession, arrogance, barbarity, and pure evil. The prosecution argued that Sarah Williams carried out the killing with an intent shaped and fed by months of planning, and that Katrina Walsh had been the co-conspirator providing tools and logistical support. The pair would face trial at Preston Crown Court, where a jury would ultimately find them guilty. The public reaction was a mixture of disbelief and outrage that two women could plan so coldly to end another person's life. It did not fit easily into ordinary notions of domestic violence or a crime of passion, the judge later emphasizing the calculated, obsessive nature of the plot. If you're following along and you want more deep dives into cases that ask hard questions about motive and justice, please subscribe and ring the bell. We release long-form investigations like this regularly, and your support helps us keep telling these stories with the detail they deserve. At trial, the diaries became witnesses of a sort. Prosecution counsel read passages that described planning, purchases, and rehearsals, entries that showed Kit writing down the pair's intentions and the steps taken to carry them out. Those pages were accompanied by physical evidence and witness testimony describing Sarah's changing behavior after her relationship with Ian ended. The defense tried to cast doubt on each link, questioning the provenance of deposits and the interpretation of diary entries, suggesting manipulation or exaggeration. But the combination of forensic linkages and the clarity of the planning recorded in Kit's own hand left jurors with little doubt. After deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts for both women. When Mr. Justice Turner sentenced the two women, he was unambiguous. He condemned Sarah Williams for plotting the murder over about 18 months. He explained that the killing was not a crime of passion, but one of obsession and calculation. In sentencing, he handed down life terms with minimum terms set at 30 years for Sarah Williams and 25 years for Katrina Walsh. A judgment designed to reflect both the horror of the crime and the planning and cold calculation that preceded it. And the family in the public gallery listened as the court tried to impose some measure of legal consequence on a violence described by many as barbaric. The sentencing remarks themselves laid bare the court's view of the crime: meticulous planning, obsession, and cruelty. For Sadie's children, for her partner Ian, for friends and colleagues, there was a yawning absence that sentencing could never fill. One of her sons said the family's lives had been destroyed and that justice, while delivered in court, could never repair what had been taken. And in the community, there was a stunned searching for reasons a woman like Sadie would be targeted by two people who seemed, to the outside world, ordinary. And in that, questioning the case raised anxieties about obsession, about the ways relationships warp, and about the hidden vulnerabilities that can draw people into conspiracies they would never otherwise imagine. Psychologists and commentators who followed the case pointed to a pattern. Obsession rarely arrives fully formed. It is built from a succession of grievances, perceived rejections, and escalating efforts to control. Sarah Williams's relationship with Ian, once personal and perhaps ordinary, shifted into the locus of an obsession. She attempted to reassert control with surveillance, with planted trackers, and with the cultivation of an accomplice who would help enact her plan. What began as Possessiveness hardened into a program of intentional harm. And in the diaries, and in the logistics, the blueprint for that harm is visible in cold ink. The case forces us to ask where jealousy ends and criminality begins, and to consider the social and psychological dynamics that convert feeling into premeditated violence. The story of Sadie Hartley's murder has since been retold in documentaries and television specials, each revisiting the planning, the evidence, the court proceedings, and the shocked reaction of the local community. Producers distilled the police files and the court transcripts into hour-long programs that tried to understand how two women could plan and carry out such an act. And these retellings kept the case in the public eye and opened wider conversations about stalking, coercion, and the signs of escalating obsession that can precede violence. Timeline, spoken cleanly so visuals can show a timeline graphic. Meeting at ski slope 2012, relationship ends, planning and gifts/dry runs through 2014 to 2015, purchase of a stun gun in Germany late 2015, dry run of flowers at Sadie's door, fatal attack January 14, 2016, arrests within days, trial and guilty verdicts in August 2016, sentencing with minimum terms of 30 years and 25 years respectively. This tidy list helps orient viewers to how a long period of obsession and planning culminated in a single fatal night. There are shades of nuance in witness statements and in reporting after the conviction. Some contemporaries described Katrina Walsh as vulnerable and suggestible. Drawn in by Sarah Williams, Kit's ex-husband spoke of his surprise and shock and described a woman who was slowly drawn into another's orbit. Friends said the two women's relationship had an intensity that blurred the lines between friendship and something deeper. And as the court would later note, even if Kit had been influenced, the diaries and the purchases she made placed her squarely in the responsibility chain, the law treating her as an active participant who carried out logistical functions and who chose to join in the planning and execution. Mr. Justice Turner's sentencing remarks were blunt and searching. He told Sarah Williams that over about 18 months, she had plotted the murder of a woman whose only crime was to love the man she wanted for herself. He warned against romanticizing the crime as passion and described it instead as obsession and barbarity. Those lines crystallized the court's interpretation. This was not the never-ending squabble of intimate partners, but instead a long, deliberate campaign of intention and cruelty. This case leaves us with questions we cannot fully answer. It asks how obsession can be identified sooner, how intervention might have prevented the deaths, and what duties we have as communities to notice escalation, to question the small rehearsals of harm, and to protect those who might be targeted. And as we look back on Sadie Hartley's life, we see the ordinary, the loved, the active person she was, and a household now forever shaped by a single violent act that should never have happened. Forensic science in this case was not about a single dramatic find, but about the accumulation of small, explainable transfers. DNA on a bath, blood traces on spectacles, purchase receipts showing where and when crucial items were bought, GPS logs that tracked car movements. Each piece of evidence was small until placed on the map with the others, and the combined weight of these items created a story that linked the accused to the murder scene in a way that jurors could read like a map of culpability, forensic work connecting the physical to the documentary to the timeline of the crime. In court, Sadie's family gave victim impact statements that pierced the formal proceedings. Charlotte and Harry and other kin spoke of grief, of a mother who would never see her daughter's wedding, of a daughter who kept the house and the schedule and the small acts of family life. They described the hole left behind and the way the legal system, even at its most forceful, could not return the ordinary daily moments their mother would have had. And those words are what remain, the personal void. That statistics and sentences cannot fill. A life sentence in the UK means a person remains subject to the sentence for life. However, the judge sets a minimum term that the offender must serve before being eligible to apply for parole. The minimum terms in this case were 30 years for Sarah Williams and 25 years for Katrina Walsh to reflect differing levels of culpability as assessed by the court. These minimums are intended to reflect the seriousness of the crime and the protective needs of society. And even when a prisoner becomes eligible to apply for release, parole boards consider a wide range of factors, and public safety remains the overriding concern. This story is not simply about two women and one terrible night. It is about how relationships can become poison, about the ways obsession twists reasoning and human bonds, about the small things, a tracking device bought online, flowers left at a door, a diary entry written in passing, that can tell a much larger story. And it is about a life ended by a moment that was long in the making, a life that the people in her orbit are still learning to live without. Sadie Hartley's name will remain in court records, in headlines, and in the minds of those who loved her. But more than that, she remains a person with a life that mattered. And in telling this story, we try to restore some of the personhood that headlines stripped away, to remember who she was beyond the violence, and to learn how to better spot the small rehearsals of harm before they become acts of irreversible brutality. Thank you for staying with us. If you found this deep dive useful, and you want full, meticulously researched true crime story like this one, hit subscribe now, and leave a comment below. Every subscription helps us research deeper, and open our eye to the evil that human can harbor. For so long we tell these stories with love and respect they deserve. Share Sadie's story to remember her. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.